Hello.
Hi there. I was beginning to wonder if I was in the wrong place or the wrong time or whatever.
How are you?
I'm good. You?
Yeah, very good, yes.
Morning, both.
Hello.
You had any comments back on the chapter 10 yet, Lisa?
No, but it has made it to the reviewers, so that's progress.
Yeah, it sat with they go first to the main editors. I mean, not us, but the journal, editors in chief or whatever. And for some reason, they seem to get stuck. It seemed to get stuck there for a long time. I think there was also a change in the sort of admin people, and somehow, anyway, for whatever reason, it got stuck. But hopefully, things will move a little faster now. But we did have to view it as a bit of a sort of a learning curve, that first one, to see how things would work. Yeah. Morning, Dennis. Is this breakfast or tenses?
Oh, tenses. Running out of marmalade, I'm going to have to go delving in the store cupboard, but never mind.
Gosh, it looks as if it must be sunny where Lisa is. Have you got sunshine?
No, I think it might be raining.
Oh, okay. You were putting
just the contrast. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, here it's indescribably miserable. So I thought if you've got sunshine, I was going to be very envious.
No, we haven't. Don't worry.
We have had a wonderful week here, but now it gets miserable again. So
we had
supposed to be Sweden.
We had an incredibly dry April with essentially no rain at all. And it's been making up for lost time since we got into May, and it's barely stopping. So. Hi.
We've lost Glenn.
Hi. Yes, I was just wondering about that. Leader.
I just finished one email. I'll be back.
Okay.
I just heard from Lorenzo. He's apologizing because he's busy and cannot join the meeting. But I'll try to update him later. Hi, Glenn.
Hi, folks. Yeah, sorry about that. Our internet just crashed. So.
Yeah, I was just saying that Lorenzo told me he cannot join this morning. He sent his apologies, but I can update him later.
Thanks. And Jasmina said she couldn't join either. Yeah, so I'm wondering whether we should just talk through the various comments and just see whether we've got a consensus on how to deal with them.
The document that you just sent was extremely helpful with all the quotes out. So yeah.
I was just thinking I might, if I share that, we could just go through that maybe.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
Okay. So I take it you can all see that. So this first comment I don't know, is largely commiserating with us, I think, isn't it?
If
I
we,
think that,
so there's a number of things that could appear in multiple papers. So if we were to donate everything that is overlapped, would there be enough stuff left for things that are just modeling? Would we have enough left for a paper? Because we're already twice as long as we need to be. Or do you think we'll just end up with sort of loads of bits that don't really make much?
well, I suppose one question is, so okay, that's, I guess that's largely this comment, I think, isn't it? So,
well, just what in the first comment when he was saying about seems to be too much on what is also in several other chapters of the current areas.
yeah,
which
I think is, so basically, this comment appears in the introduction when we introduce the second half of the paper. So it's kind of like all the kind of less traditional modeling bits, I guess. So yeah, I guess that's the biggest question we need to ask. My feeling is that number one, my feeling is that those parts of the paper we want modelers to read, because we kind of feel they're important for modelers to think about, and they're not things that modelers normally think about, or at least certainly if we go down the route of cutting those out, then we'll focus this paper on the sort of what modelers would typically focus on. And so I just wonder whether we're doing a disservice to the community by cutting that out, because they won't necessarily go and read these other papers. I don't know, but
I think,
at least some might not.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to read. He says, "I have not read Kretschmar et al. Yet." Obviously, he hasn't. I mean, I think it may have gone to him now, but it hadn't then. Neither had he read. He hadn't had Ben's paper on estimation or the data paper.
Yeah.
So he's going on the way that we put all these cross references in, and that I wonder if that's misleading. I mean, we haven't necessarily seen all the things yet either, particularly on interventions and so on. But I mean, we were very anxious to make sure that we put in all these cross references so that we didn't duplicate stuff. And Hans is interpreting it as the fact that there's a cross reference means we are duplicating it. And so I'm not quite sure whether we really are. I think we need to look at the cross references and make them much more specific. Mostly, not necessarily all of them. I mean, obviously in the introduction, you might want to say that there's another paper on data that deals with these things, and that would be a reference to the whole paper. But in general, I think during the paper, maybe we need to be much more specific about a cross-reference to a particular section and why we're cross-referencing it.
Well, I think there are
to try to make it clear what the challenges are and which are being covered where.
I think I mean the criticisms about sort of coverage are, one, that we haven't got right our coverage of the past and recent developments, which is the sort of reference back to the 2015 challenges, and the other, that we've possibly haven't got right overlaps with other papers, which may be the more appropriate place to say some of the things we're saying. So, where does that leave us? I think it leaves us to trying to justify having a generic modelling paper, which I think I think is easy to justify, really. So yes, it needs to have its links to the past and the recent past, and the 2015 challenges better done. And as regards other papers like the interventions, I suppose it's possibly got a role, hasn't it, sort of like introducing things, but also but more really, I think there is a sort of, well, there has to be a role for, as it were, generic modelling, so that in other words, it may be motivated to some extent by interventions, which is the big new thing. But I think there are questions that modelers would want to work on that you wouldn't really think of as part of interventions, but are more general for the future. So I really feel we've got a niche. We just need to do two things, well, three things. One is to do this looking back at the 2015 challenges, particularly to look so as to, and possibly also to, maybe in terms of background, looking at the past, maybe we could actually make some cuts.
Yeah.
And the second thing is to look at the overlaps or the relationship to other papers like the interventions, and where there is an overlap or potential overlap, to say, have we got the border between the two papers right? Where, a potential thing we could say is we could go along to Miriam, say, hey, you've nicked part of our subject, give it back. Your paper should have this stuff cut out because it really belongs with us. Alternatively, we might say, well, actually, Miriam's quite right. She's doing just the right amount of modelling background for interventions. We should just be trying to provide, if you like, a sort of introduction or background to that sort of,
I think in an ideal world, one would make a distinction between the sort of theoretical aspects of modelling interventions, if we can, the sort of more generic things, and the more applied part, but that's easier said than actually done, I suspect, in drawing this line down the middle. But I would like to think that this paper would cover sort of the generic aspects of interventions, and Miriam's would cover the more applied.
I think that's a good way of thinking of it. I think that's a good way of thinking of it. And if you think of there being like a sort of international frontier between us and Miriam, then it doesn't really matter if the frontier's wrong in a few places, if something that really ought to be covered by us is covered by her and vice versa, if it sort of makes a more coherent narrative in either paper. But as a sort of broad idea, I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah. So I guess a task is to sort of take each of those. Well, essentially, there's kind of 4 papers, aren't there, that we reference quite a lot. I mean, probably we need to look at whether we need to reference other papers in the special issue.
Sorry, Glenn, not catching you there.
So I guess a task is maybe to take each of those 4 papers in the special issue that we reference quite a bit here. So that's the data, interventions, and or maybe it's only 3, and the estimation one, and just kind of do a double check about where the border is and whether there is a more or less distinct.
Yeah, exactly. I think we need, I mean, a work plan might be that to list both the challenge paper background, which is about 5 different papers in the 2015 volume, and the possible overlaps going in the other direction with the present volume, which, as you say, is about 4 of the other papers here. And so that gives 10 little investigations to be carried out where, ideally perhaps 2 or 3 of us, or at least 2 of us, would do each bit so we could discuss with each other. I might, since I was involved in that back in 2015, for instance, I might include the spatial modelling challenge. If I did that and someone else did that, then we could each have a look at it and see if we can't sharpen up our act on that one. And similarly, a couple of us could look at the overlap with interventions and see whether we think the boundary's in the right place. Whether, I mean, I suppose the ideal is a boundary that doesn't have overlap and where minimum amount of cross-reference is needed, where it maybe it just needs like a clear statement, like the more applied side of this is covered by the other such and such paper.
I mean,
and from her point of view, she can say something like some of the background in general modelling is covered by our paper. And rather than, I think Hans was a bit critical of there being what he described as 10 references to the data paper. So obviously it would be better if those could be rolled into 1 or 2 or 3.
Yeah, I mean, in retrospect, I think
if there are 10 cross references are needed, it suggests the boundary there is untidy.
Yeah, in retrospect, I probably got a bit carried away in the sort of final phases of putting cross references in. So I think that's a fair comment based on what he's seen.
I think what Dennis's approach works very well for the cross references to the other challenges papers. I'm not so sure about the 2015 thing, simply because there are quite a few papers there, and we can't, I think, in the length really go into the detail of what all the challenges were in the 5 or 6 papers that were on modelling there.
No, so, I think Hans has said that he doesn't expect us to go back to the 40 or so individual challenges.
Exactly.
Maybe some of us should actually just browse down those a little bit more and see if there are things we could reference. It might not end up changing so much what we say, but maybe if as it were, we could find one sentence for each of those 5 or 6 challenge papers from 2015 reference back to it.
I mean, in an ideal world, one would like to say very concisely what the broad classes of challenges were in modelling then, and what's changed since then, what major steps forward there have been, and what's still outstanding. But I don't know how easy it is to sort of encapsulate that in. But if we could put a couple of paragraphs in the introduction which did that, then we could just move on from there. I think at the moment we've got quite a lot. We've done quite a bit of sort of history going back before that, and quite a lot of earlier references. And perhaps we should be aiming to take sort of 2015 more as a starting point, so that more of our references would be post that.
I think that's what Hans is.
Yes, I mean he puts that somewhere exactly.
Expecting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the impression I got was that, maybe I think that's a good idea, Valerie, putting the context in here a bit more and sort of saying where we fit in.
I mean, can we easily say what the big advances have been in the last 5 years in modelling? What would you point to? Peter, jumpy, I'm looking at you.
Yes. I am thinking of, so there is definitely a lot more data which models are more aware of or are more applied in modeling. So I'm not sure about following, but I think it's actually an advantage that there are way more people involved in modeling which do not have a strong mathematical conscience, who are not too careful to use their models even if things are not exactly proved or proven, or I don't know how we can involve that, but or perhaps that's a personal evolution in myself, that I am more aware of that research.
So I guess that we could do a little bit of study. I don't have everything in my head now of what papers on models have been published since 2015 and what they are about. And my feeling is that methodology hasn't changed that much, in the sense that the people were already aware of network models or other kinds of complications then. I don't know about the field that Peter maybe is referring to, namely economists and other people who have written about epidemics and what to do with epidemics. That field I don't know very much. So maybe I should sit down and look at references for these last 6 years. But I guess that the big news is the COVID period that has engendered a lot of work on models. But that work has been focused on the COVID stuff. And the COVID stuff has mainly been focused on interventions. Because the models have not been revolutionary that have been used to model COVID as such. I mean, it has been the question of should one do, as Ferguson said, have a zigzag intervention, or should one do differently, and etc. So I don't know. Hans's comment is really interesting in the sense that it takes some soul gazing to understand what has really been done these last 6 or 7 years. I'm not sure that we have that much to report on the theoretical side, but more on the application, and the application is mainly COVID, as far as I understand. But I might be wrong. I would have to really sit down and look at references to see if I've forgotten something or haven't read something.
I don't think I've really kept up at all well with it, but my broad impression is in agreement with that, is that there hasn't been much change in the sort of modeling kit that people use. There are probably a great number of more detailed programs and data sets and so on being used, but often being used with stuff with models which I suspect were not even at the sort of frontiers of development in 2015. You know, that you know, the problems of whether you do best to represent things by general sorts of networks, or by compartmental models, or by agent-based models. I mean, I feel people have been using these and probably developing them with more and more data, but the basic questions like, am I really choosing the best sort of model for the applied problem I have? Don't see much about.
I was just doing a very limited literature study looking at what I have written since 2015, and I have used models in various applications. I kind of did counterfactual studies of what would have happened if we had vaccinated earlier or later for the swine flu. And I've done other studies about vaccination against varicella, but using rather standard models. The question was to create scenarios with different kinds of implications on secondary things like herpes zoster, etc. But there's nothing new in modeling, effectively. The only thing that was slightly interesting was that I did the statistical stuff with Tom Britton, about how you could misinterpret data in the beginning of an epidemic because of various effects of exponential increase. But there's nothing new in modeling technique that I have participated in. That's, of course, very limited knowledge about the progress these last 6 years.
So I suppose one way of answering Hans's comments, given what I highlighted there, is maybe to sort of look at what, I mean, I think we have done this a bit anyway, but maybe just highlight a bit more where the currently available methods don't really do what we need them to do, given what we've learned through COVID. So I think, the contact tracing part did talk quite a bit about that, that we don't really have the tools that we need to answer the questions, how is contact tracing going to help, or how much is it going to help? So I think we've kind of done it there, but maybe we just need to be more explicit.
I was also wondering, I do not know much about agent-based modeling, and it's perhaps a pity that Jasmina is not here now. I think what happened in the last few years in models is the explicit travel patterns, how to include that. I think that's pretty recent and not mentioned in too much in the 2015 papers, if I'm not mistaken. There was something about the gravity models, which are in some way including the travel patterns, but
yeah.
But I guess that many of these things, like say gravity models, have been replaced by using Google mobility data.
Yeah.
Taking real data streams instead of a hypothetical model of contacts or something like that. So of course, yes, maybe you're right that one change is more and more use of big data in the models, that you just take Google mobility data as a time-dependent covariate in your model, and then that should explain how the epidemic moved or something like that. That yes, presumably has happened. But the question is, this will kind of change the style of our paper, right? If we go on this route to first say what has happened since 2015, then we have to kind of concentrate a little bit on that. And then what should happen next if we want to say what's missing. And then maybe a comment on the influence of this COVID period, which has been important. And that mainly is on these things like modeling interventions or predicting interventions, or maybe we could talk a little bit about how people have used RT. That's a hot topic. Right now in Italy, everybody wants to get rid of the restrictions, and therefore many politicians are, for instance, proposing that RT should be calculated on hospital admissions instead of data on infections, because that would favor them, because hospital admissions are going down right now because of vaccination. So what is RT and how has it been used but still, I mean, that would only refer, I guess, to other papers. Or I don't know, should we do this? Because it's a big change to the present paper.
Yeah, I mean, my feeling is
novelty route. Let's call it novelty route.
Yeah, my feeling is that we could probably do that without a major structural change, that we could simply in each section try and, I mean, maybe it will lead to a big structural change, but maybe in the first step would be just to look at what we currently have and try and add that element to the discussion of each part. So, identify where there have been changes or where, well, either where there have been developments that have pushed things forward in terms of, or where we've realized that there are gaps in what we're able to do.
At the same time, I feel that Hans wants us to also cut away that part that could be in some sense reference to what we already said, what was already said 6 years ago, or at least say it in a shorter way. Already 6 years ago, it was pointed out how useful it would be to have agent-based model, and not very much has happened since then. Something like that, or the opposite. I don't know. I found that Hans's comments were kind of nice and positive, but they essentially said that this paper is not very good. That's what he thought.
Yeah.
I thought it was rather negative in a sense, although he didn't say that directly. But I don't know what you think about this issue, how we should go forward.
I mean, well, so my view is that there were three really big things that he said. So one was that the second half of the paper from 6.3 onwards probably shouldn't even be here, but we can't.
Because it is in the other papers, you mean?
Yeah, and because it's not really about modeling, but I kind of feel that that's well, one, if we did that, that would really radically change the paper. But also, I kind of feel that some of these things are important messages for modelers to read about, and the people that we want to read it wouldn't read it if it was in the interventions paper or in the data paper or so on. So that's one point. And then the other two big things I think are this section 6.1 in particular. He seems to think that we need to put more information about what's happened in the last 6 years and or these issues about where models are being tested. And then there was quite a long comment in 6.2 talking about basically in response to this text in the paper, he then has basically said that this is a big area that we should talk more about, which I think is doable. So my feeling is that we should focus on section 6.1 and try and rewrite that and then see where we are. Is what I think is probably our biggest job. I don't know. I'm happy for other people to say that they think that's the wrong interpretation, but I mean,
I think if we could get our heads round getting the right perspective in 6.1, then the rest would all follow fairly naturally. Somehow that, you know, if we can somehow just switch it round a bit to make it a bit more specific in the way that he's been describing, and take out a bit of the you know, the earlier background.
Do you have any idea if he has answered to other papers? Which one was in first before ours?
The policy one was, I think, the first one that we saw.
Do we have any idea what he said about those? Are the comments similar or different? I mean, is it our style or in general?
Well, I think we're the first of a set of possibly overlapping related papers, with the interventions and estimation and data. So,
yeah. We are the first.
I think, as has already been remarked, he's maybe a little bit assuming that those will cover things in a way that they won't necessarily. So, but I think perhaps for that reason, all the more that we should be looking at our relations to those other papers and just seeing if we're happy ourselves with relation to them.
Well, the latest versions of everything is on the site, right? In the Dropbox.
Yeah.
So that means we have a lot of reading to do, and then also reread the 2015 issue to see what was really predicted there about future developments or hoped for. A lot of reading. Yes, I guess that Glenn is right that we have to decide on how to interpret Hans at the moment, and then go on that line. I mean, does Hans want us just to rewrite some sections in a certain way, or does he want us to start reading a lot of things first and then decide.
I mean, what I took from it is that we probably need to, you know, we probably do need to look at the, well, at least I need to look at the literature more from 2015 onwards and sort of see where we could add some nice references in that, you know, show their developments, because I guess there is a bit of a gap. Although there are quite a few references from the last year or so, but
I downloaded that issue. It's 10 megabytes of stuff to read, but of course we don't have to read all the challenge papers.
It's in the IDP Dropbox.
It's already there. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
There are kind of 25 papers.
It's a folder on the same level as the modeling folder, just called 2015 something or other.
Yes.
And I mean, I've got the table of contents up on my screen. I mean, I did read a few of them, like about 10 of them, when we were writing this, and you know, that I guess because they're challenge papers, they're quite broad things. So I mean, there is a degree of overlap in the things that we're saying here. But so I do think one of the issues is just the lack of references between now and then. Sorry, Dennis, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I'm also looking at the table of contents, and it starts out with 7 papers for modeling indirect transmission by vector-borne diseases.
you want to be down on the 3rd page or so, Jean-P. 4th page, maybe even. There are some headings in capital letters, and there's a heading of modeling methodology on, is it Roman 7, isn't it? It's the page. Okay, it's a page that is the top thing on that page is 5 challenges in evolution.
Yes.
The 3rd paper has this heading, modeling methodology, and then there were 5 papers called modeling methodology, and then there's a section called data. If you're moving on one further page, then you get a capital letters heading data analysis and integration, and there are some pages there that papers there that have some relevance. I mean, starting with the one about contact networks for use in modeling. So there might be references to those, but the main ones are the 5 under modeling methodology.
Yes.
Deterministic, global, network, household, spatial.
I mean, if we could take each of those 5 areas and just try and identify what, if any, progress has been or changes have been made.
I think the question is yeah, exactly. So it's some sort of. I mean, if you think in terms of box ticking, it's sort of trying to classify each challenge very rapidly as being, you know, so some progress made. Don't really think that's a challenge any longer, or still a challenge and hasn't been not much progress. And I suppose, and then what one wants to, and then one could bundle that up in references here to maybe ignoring quite a lot of them, but trying to point to a few where progress has, the kind of things where progress has been made, and then, but most of all, I guess, trying to identify the kinds of challenges which haven't really seen much progress and which we think still are important. I mean, maybe would it, I mean, I'd be happy to be one of a small number of people who looked at that, but maybe we should all be looking at it and have an email stream. We could have an email with the topic references to 2015, something like that, and we can just, as we each do a bit of reading, we can chip in as concisely as we can what our thoughts are on that. Would that be helpful, Glenn?
I think that would be very helpful, yeah.
And then we could have another email stream, which could be called overlaps with other papers, where we could do the same there. So for instance, look at the interventions paper and say, or the latest draft, and say, what is the overlap with it, and the data paper and the estimation paper. And in each case, just try and say, has that got a substantial overlap? How would we best, and if it's got a substantial overlap, which way is the boundary to move? And how can we refer to it concisely? As I say, I think the most difficult situation is if we think those other papers have stolen something that should be in our paper, in which case we have a bit of diplomacy. But apart from that, it's just a matter of making up for our own minds how to write something that interfaces nicely with those other papers and that we can refer to in as concise a way as possible in our paper. So, we might have something that would say that a major change, the single biggest change in modeling recently has been that because of the current pandemic, this huge emphasis on how you model interventions, and that is dealt with in paper on interventions. We just, maybe we just discuss one or two sort of generic points to do with that, or what people who are doing general models should be doing to help the people who are doing this new intervention stuff. So,
yep.
Well, if I may say, what I feel personally is that maybe I should take 1 week to read up on things, to have a more grounded opinion on what has been done these last 6 years, not only what I have done, but what others have done these last 6 years. So to know how to orient this paper, because we still have the choice. One is about progress in the modeling field in general during these years, and some references back to challenges that are not completed yet. The other one is to orient it more towards what has COVID taught us about necessary progress in modeling. And I guess these two ways we'll have to decide a little bit. Because of course, we know that this paper is being written in the time of COVID.
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, it's sort of implicit that anyway, the second of those is kind of implicit in what we've been doing, I think.
Yes, but if we think about what has the COVID period and these last 15 months or whatever it is taught us about modeling, then I guess it points very much towards understanding interventions and advising interventions and measuring progress of interventions and linking it to policy or whatever, and not so much on methodology. I haven't seen new models arising to describe COVID. I mean, they are the same old compartmental models mostly, or agent-based models. Perhaps there has been more use of things like Google mobility in the analysis of how things have worked with COVID. I've seen some papers like that kind of show graphs how well correlated incidences are with the Google mobility or something like that. But
I think that one other aspect is the thing which Jamie Lloyd Smith talked about at one of his talks, is the modeling, modeling or measuring. I think it's modeling of how the transmission actually occur, or how the virus is transmitted outside the host. So
all this aerodynamic stuff about
Yeah.
how far you can cough and what happens in a train wagon and stuff like that.
things like that.
Yes, we
that-
get
I was
attention on
just
that.
reading a thing. I think it was linked from the New York Times, but about the difficulty that WHO and others had in accepting that the importance of airborne transmission, and saying that there's been a long problem going back 50 or more years where people, the whole epidemiological whatever community got the idea that only particles smaller than 5 microns could aerosol transmission, and therefore it couldn't possibly be important for a whole lot of diseases like flu and so on. And I'm wondering actually if the resistance to believing in aerial transmission goes back to the germ theory of the late 19th century, because before that there was the sort of miasma theory. You know, one of the reasons why buildings of the 19th century have high ceilings is because it was thought to be healthier to have plenty of space indoors. And then when the germ theory came along, I think scientists thought that that was all nonsense. You know, it was pre-scientific stuff. So the idea that actually you might, because that's what aerosol transmission is, isn't it really? You know, if I've got the disease and I go and spend half an hour in a room, by the time I've finished, there is a sort of miasma of teeny infectious particles throughout the atmosphere in that room. And
No, people had understood that a long time ago. I mean, they called malaria because of bad air.
yeah,
Which was
exactly.
wrong.
Exactly,
That's what they thought.
I think what I'm trying to say is I think the history is something like, firstly, that the idea of bad air was thought to be pre-scientific. So from about 1900 onwards, it was an idea that was thought to be rather unscientific. And then you have these studies, which I think date from the 1930s or the 1950s, of aerosols, where the epidemiologists got, if you like, they got the wrong idea about how small particles had to be transmitted by aerosol. And so, yeah. And anyway, maybe I'll put the link to the article. It was quite interesting. It's a sort of historical article.
I mean, we do kind of have a section on that. No doubt it could be massively improved, but we did sort of add something about environmental transmission.
Because, you know, I mean, thinking as a mathematician, you can only model things as well as the more basic scientists offer you the description of them. If they are absolutely convinced that the thing is the kind of thing which is transmitted by surfaces, then you as a mathematician tend to believe the scientists and go and study a model in which transmission is by surfaces.
I can tell you that one thing which played definitely a role in the Netherlands is there is a very obnoxious guy, sociologist / statistician, who is really annoying in his presentation, who brought the idea of aerosols quite early on the television, in his opinion, and basically claiming all those people at the Public Health Institute are still stupid not to take it into account. All other measures can be lifted apart from, well, there should be good ventilation and people should stay away from indoors meetings. All very wise and in hindsight as well, but he was so obnoxious in it that and annoying that people don't want to admit it, and I think that has put some brake on it.
Yes, that could be a little chapter, but maybe we have that as well on communication of science.
Yeah,
and the importance of that.
He was wrong
Okay.
in 10 other claims, by the way, but this one was one he was right in, I think.
Again, we kind of do have a section on communication and science.
Yeah.
No, but fact is that in the paper as it is now, there are plenty of ideas and things that certainly can remain. The question is how to maybe change a little bit, as Valerie said, the point of view or
Yeah.
basic strategy in writing. I don't know what to call it. Every paper has, hopefully, has some kind of storyline that goes through the paper, right? And the question is if that's one that we should change a little bit. If this seems too much looking back, saying wise things, instead it should be looking forward more in some sense, or looking laterally, which is what is suggested, that maybe most progress has been made in fields that inform modeling more than in the modeling itself, because all this aerodynamic stuff, or whatever you want to call it, is something that will inform modeling more and more.
Yeah.
Perhaps the reason that we've tended to look back is because the problems haven't really changed very much in the last 5 years. I mean, the fact that we're struggling to think what the progress has been from on the generic side, presumably is sort of saying that when we've described this general bit in the early section, we're going back to the problems that still exist, but the references are too early. But you know, perhaps we can just spin that a different way and explain what has changed and what the problems were then, and to the extent that they're still the big issues. But of course, everything has changed in perspective in the last 15 months or so.
And I guess we do start, you know, I know Hans doesn't really like the historic perspective part, but we kind of started off by saying that, you know, big changes in mathematical epidemiology have been prompted by past pandemics, and and so that's kind of consistent with saying that, you know, what this paper is about is to then learn what, you know, try and identify what the lessons are from the current pandemic. But then we've also got this other added brief of trying to say, you know, how things should be in future pandemics, which means we shouldn't completely rely on COVID as a guide.
Yeah.
People noticed I put that reference in the aerosol thing in chat.
I was also wondering, I don't know if it helps with the contents or the structure, but linking to what have been said, if we can maybe expand on the role of modeling that we have observed recently. Well, I don't have much experience of previous epidemics, but my feeling was that in the pandemic has seen most of the success of the very simple models, or models that theoretically are very simple, but the computational power and the amount of data. So we use the computational power and the amount of data to use models that are theoretically simple, just compartmental models, rather than much theoretical work behind it. But on the other hand, I believe that previous theoretical work have been used to understand maybe evolution of or emerging of new variants. For example, I believe that the previous theoretical work has been very important for that. So I was wondering if we could comment on the role of modeling that have been observed in practice, that there is a phase where theoretical work is less, so during the pandemic, there's not much theoretical work going on, but still theoretical work in peacetime is very valuable.
Hi, can I say something? So one aspect of I guess, theoretical work that has developed is about combining models, because the way that R is produced is as a is using a combination algorithm that picks up the outcomes from different models. So even if there are discrepancies or differences between different models, then when you combine them, you get a range, and that's why R is given as a range when you produce it as an official statistics. So that part is maybe, I wouldn't spend too long dwelling around the theoretical framework, but maybe that's aspect that we didn't touch upon. And just to say that I think overall, like any paper, we can start and rewrite this from the beginning and incorporate lots of changes, but I think it's also about the point of view of the writers versus the reviewer. So when I read through it, I put some comments in what I thought, you know, was important. And I missed the first half of this conversation, but I can look through, I can only see like the bit that is now here, and I'll read through it in details. But so just, I think we have to be wary about how much do we actually want to change at this point.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah, my feeling is it does need some changing, but you know, in a way, it's a kind of ratcheting towards, you know, to accommodate Hans's point of view more rather than a radical change. But
yeah, and I think as somebody said, we've been writing this during the pandemic. This paper would have been different had we written it in 2019, and if we write it in 2023, say. And I think that's important aspect that should be noted in the preview, the first, you know, the conversation part that goes at the beginning of these papers, and that Valerie and Dennis will write it. So yeah.
And possibly what's needed is just some sort of clearer signposting about what we're trying to say, you know, what the broader context is. But I do agree with Dennis that I think looking back and GMP as well, that looking back and at what's happened since looking back at the 2015 papers and then thinking about those areas and whether they've really evolved would be kind of useful, just to make sure that we're on solid ground. So maybe that is a task for the next week. I don't know how people feel about that. Take silence with agreement.
Silence is golden.
Are you continuing to half 11, or not half 1, half 11, or are you stopping at 11? Because I'm gonna need to go.
I mean, I'm available, but I'm kind of wondering whether we need to keep going or whether, I mean, I'm happy to keep going if we want to keep chatting.
A general question: how much time do we have? Was there any kind of a submission time thought for this epidemics issue? So how much time do we have to change things before we kind of?
It was the 31st of March is the first answer.
Okay.
The second answer is I think we're going to need, you know, more than 1 week to get this right. So I think we should.
Shall we then take 1 week of reading time and thinking time, and then we come back to?
Yeah, I think that would be great, but I think maybe a hybrid between that and Dennis's suggestion, which is that while we're reading, if we see something that we think, oh, you know, this is something I didn't know about, or that I think you guys should know about, then we send an email around so that other people have a chance to read. Mm-hmm. You know, part of the issue is knowing what's there, isn't it? It's, if someone comes across something they think is significant, I think it'd be useful.
Yeah, no, I think it would be nice to, well, I have to apologize. I'll probably not be here for next Friday, but I was going to, but for next Friday, I think it would be good to have to have reports back from several different people in each case who have looked at, on the one hand, who've looked back at the 2015 challenges and have some concrete suggestions, preferably, you know, even draft paragraphs that could be included or revised or whatever. But certainly how we should respond on that. And secondly, that people should have, we should be able to have some informed views on the overlaps with the other papers. So we should do some reading, yes, but the reading should then try and feed back into suggestions that will help us revise the paper.
Mm.
Is that what you're asking, Glenn?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, yeah. I wasn't thinking of just. That's why I was saying I think we should share via email what we.
Yeah. So I mean, are there three things? Because there's this looking back, there's the overlaps, and then I suppose there's also trying to make sure that the territory we are left with is presented coherently. That this is the sort of generic modelling where there are still important, you know, generic problems that feed into these various other fields, but they present challenges which are not challenges that come under these other more specialised headings.
Yeah. So you mean emphasise the sort of modelling challenges rather than.
Yeah, because I think that's. Because I think we our the dual function, the reason why I think it would still be very good to have this paper in the volume is firstly that it hopefully provides introduction, something that can be referred to by some of those other papers, but secondly also that it tries to identify some generic challenges for modelers that can keep the more theoretically minded people doing useful stuff for the future.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think some of that second part probably is something we need to deal with in the following week, but once we've seen what we have.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Well, I think the first thing is, yes, I think the first thing is to were to look at the base. Are we referring to the right things in the past, and have we got the overlaps and cross references with other papers right?
Do we want to split it up now between ourselves?
Well, it would probably be good if people would people would like.
No, I'm not sure that this is a separate sections thing right now. I have more the feeling that it's a general line thing about the paper to avoid, as has been said, overlaps with some other papers in this collection. Yeah. And well, that overlap will be in many sections.
Yeah. Well, that was why I made the suggestion that we have just two sort of email conversations, a conversation called the 2015 relation to the past, or 2015 challenges or something, and a second stream that's called overlaps, so that we can,
this collection, you mean?
We can each look at whatever we feel we're best equipped or most interested in of that. But if we put them into email conversations like that, it will hopefully become clear where we have useful views and where we don't.
Yeah,
I don't think we want to fragment it more than that at the moment, do we, Glenn?
I don't think so, because I think in a way that's what we're trying to do, is bring things together.
Yeah. But we more or less agreed then that Hans' main comments were these 2 points. Kind of back in time a little bit, see what the overlap is, and this collection, what the overlap is.
Yeah.
Yeah, probably that's what he mainly said. And then there were some detailed comments, but those can be inserted. I mean, have a reference or not, or.
Yeah, there's quite a few that are fairly straightforward.
Okay, so then we have something to do for a week, and we can write emails then to all of us, to each other, about what we think during this week.
Yeah.
And then we meet again, same time, same place, next Friday. Is that?
That suits me. Hopefully everyone else, most other people.
Is Dennis' problem just exactly this time on Friday, or
No,
in general?
No, my problem is that we have a cottage in the far north of Scotland that is let out to other people, and even if we didn't just want to go there ourselves, we need to go there, and it doesn't have the internet. So it's just possible I could stand on some remote hotspot with my phone and join in, but otherwise, no, I'm going to be away for a few days. So no, you carry on. I'll try and join in the email.
Okay.
And in particular, I'll try and make some comments in the email before I go.
Great. Okay, so I'll send a couple of emails just telling people about these other who aren't here about these two conversations, and we'll meet next Friday and speak.
Yes, you can maybe remind us all that the whole issue apparently is already here in the Dropbox of 2015.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And so are, of course, all the latest versions, I guess, of all the other papers, right? If we just look up
Yes,
into
indeed.
their...
And in the 2015 volume, the first thing to look at is the thing that's called Table of Contents, and
and I will point people towards this modeling methodologies.
Yeah, exactly. It's the 5 papers that are headed modeling methodology that are the most relevant, though there might be other things to pick up on. Okay.
I'm not sure. Jumpy was saying about all the other versions. For most papers there are, but I'm not sure whether there are 1 or 2 that might not be. But unless it's got updated. No, for example, the emergence one, I don't think the latest one of that is there. But there is also now a folder called Submitted, and that's got a couple of submitted
Numbers 2 and
things
10.
in, so, yeah.
Yeah.
But
Submitted
Emergence worked on Google Docs, and somehow it isn't in the Dropbox.
But does submitted mean that you are officially submitted, or that you are in the same situation as us?
No, submitted means precisely that this is the version that has been sent in to the journal.
Okay. While ours is kind of preliminary, right? It's not the submitted version. Okay.
All right.
Okay. Then we don't have any free time problems for next week.
Rather the opposite.
Yes.
Okay, thanks, Glenn.
All right, thanks.
And the same time next week.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. See you then.
Bye, all of
Thank
you.
you. Bye. Thank you.